So far this conference has been about involving citizens in deciding what to do or how to do it, through things like consultation and co-deliberation, co-design. There's a lot of co's out there, feedback and so on. And the assumption is that the service will be delivered to citizens by government. Now, co-production is actually about taking things further and having citizens take part in actually producing the service. And that's a fundamental difference. Now, this idea, of course, is becoming popular in governments around the world, and on balance, I think that's kind of a good thing. However, I find that alongside this idea, alongside this flourishing interest in the idea, there are also a lot of misconceptions about it. And it turns out that each of the key issues in co-production has its own misconception to shadow it. And so what I want to do is to deal with both the issues and the misconceptions in tandem. And the issues are, in a sense, like a roadmap of what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to be dealing with 5 key questions. Firstly, what is co-production? Secondly, what do we mean by citizens? Thirdly, how do we identify potential co-producers? Fourthly, when should co-production be utilised? And fifthly, how can co-production be elicited from citizens? And each of those is shadowed by a misconception which sits here, and I'll deal with those a bit later, and you can at that stage find out what the wouldn't it be lovely misconception is. So let's launch into these. Firstly, what is co-production? Well, this question raises what I call the governance misconception, which I've just started to allude to, and that is the misconception that co-production is about joint deliberation or consultation. That is about involving citizens in deciding what to do or how to do it, as well as producing. I think there's a fairly loose usage of this term, and I want to clarify that, because I think this term has been used far too indiscriminately. We don't use the word production to include deciding what to do, so why use the word co-production to include co-deciding what to do? Co-production is about doing it, not about deciding what to do. Now, that's not to say that co-production is unimportant. It is. It's just sort of something different from co-production. Nor is it to say that when you're engaging in co-productive processes, there isn't a lot of co-deliberation happening alongside it. But what I want to do is just distinguish it analytically as a term, because it's more useful to do that for reasons I hope that will become clear. So in terms of defining it then, I think there are a number of considerations. So imagine on the horizontal axis here, we're talking about who the work can be done by. On the one end, it could be done by the government organisation acting alone. On the other end, by the external party acting alone. Or alternatively, it could be done jointly by them. The other thing makes that distinction I talked about between deciding what to do and doing it. And in all of that then, I think that strictly speaking, we should refer to co-production as the doing it, where it's done jointly by a government organisation and an external party. However, it's never quite that simple, and that's why there's a 1 next to this heading, because there's also a 2 and a 3. I think that there are some activities like planning and design where it's more focused on the activity that's to be co-produced, where we're starting to get into a borderline between co-production and co-design and those sorts of things. So I think that some of those activities can lead to that, and if you're in an architect's office or a planner's office, you'll certainly see them as part of that. But then, even further than that, there are quite a lot of activities that are done by private parties, be they companies, individuals or whatever, with no apparent connection with government, but they do it because government pushes them. And I think that we need to acknowledge that, where what I might call nudged production or self-service. And nudge, of course, has become very popular with the great book about that topic. And what I'm talking about is things like, or for example, a driver driving somewhere slowing down at an intersection because there's a roundabout is to some extent being nudged by the government to put the roundabout there, and that contributes to a public purpose of reducing the road toll and so on. And I'm sure you know of many other examples. So what I'm basically saying then is that co-production is stuff that's done jointly, but also stuff that's been prompted by some action or behaviour or incentive provided by a government agency. It can include planning and design, but certainly the real focus is on actually doing it. So that's the first definitional question, hopefully out of the way. A second thing is, what do we mean by citizens? And this raises the unitary citizen misconception, which has been touched on a number of times in this program, including by Linnell Briggs yesterday. And I think that there's often a failure to distinguish among different faces of the citizen. And I think that's important because there's often debate about this. So I think that first of all we need to acknowledge that citizens are first, foremost and always part of the collective we who contribute to determining what government should do through all the processes of democracy that we enjoy in our country, who enjoy the public value that governments create, and who have, associated with both of those things, various rights and responsibilities. So first and foremost, we're citizens. But I want to also argue that we actually have multiple other roles in which we can function as co-producers. Firstly, we're clients. And notice we can be both a citizen and a client. So we interact with government in terms of public value, but we interact with individual agencies or individual services that might provide some private value. And often our enjoyment of the private value contributes to public value in the process. For example, school pupils who get an education, that's good for them and their life chances, but it's also good for the society that we are literate and numerate and all of those sort of things. Sometimes it's something I wonder about when I encounter some students, but not ANZSOG ones. So beneficiary clients are people who receive services but don't pay for it, and they are receiving what we might call private value. A second group are what we might call obligatees or regulatees. That is, people being subjected to obligations by the government agency. That also affects their private value, often negatively, and we impose obligations on people for the sake of the society at large, even if the individual has to take a hit for that. But they're clearly in some different kind of interaction than the citizen as part of the collective citizenry. And then we've also got people who are not in those service encounters with government, but who also contribute. And the best term I've been able to come up with this is volunteers. Now, we volunteer formally when we volunteer to do stuff for a government department or a non-profit or community organisation. Think Country Fire Service, think Meals on Wheels and so on. But we also tend to, I think that the activity that I had the most trouble trying to categorise was where we see random acts of sociability and helpfulness in the community. And in a sense I regard that's where it's contributing to something for the community as a whole, but it's not necessarily organised through the formal channels of government or non-profit community organisations. So these are the people I'm focusing on. And just to be clear, what we're not focusing on, there are other co-producers such as companies, non-profit organisations or other government organisations, and you'll notice they're all organisations and they're made up of citizens, and they often organise and channel the work of citizens, but they're not citizens in the terms that I'm talking about. So we're leaving those aside in the course of this. And so this is our focus: citizens as part of the collective we, beneficiary clients, obligatees, stroke regulatees and volunteers. This leads me to the next question. How do we identify potential co-producers? And this question raises, for reasons that I hope will become clear, the answer to this question provides the basis for challenging another misconception about co-production, which, with due deference to Eliza Doolittle and the play My Fair Lady, I call the wouldn't it be lovely misconception. The view that co-production is a new thing which would be nice to have. In fact, my research shows that in many, and probably most areas of public sector work, co-production is already an established reality. Let me explain by way of an example. An example is a fire brigade. We'll start simply and work up to a more complex picture. So imagine we've got, and part of this is that in looking at it simply, we can think of what the work of a fire brigade in output terms, that its purpose is to put out fires quickly and efficiently. We think of that in that simple terms. So beginning with outputs, or in fact, so imagine a situation, a house catches fire, there's an incident, and the output would be that the fire is put out. And there is a core production process between those two things. Firstly, OOO might be called, a dispatcher would send a fire truck would speed to the fire, and the fire would be hosed with water. This is an example, by the way, of the sophisticated analysis we do at ANZSOG. What it's highlighting is a core production process. And the reason I put that is because what's interesting is that once OOO has been called, most of the work is done by the fire brigade. So it's done internally in the organisation. So we're talking so far about the internal production of desired outputs. But when you start to think about the work of a fire brigade, it becomes clear that these internal processes rely on processes performed by external parties, which I call co-productive contributions. So here's the process we've just identified, and what I argue is there are a number of things also feeding into that. So for a start, you need external parties like neighbours or property owners and occupants to ring OOO. It's sort of hard to know to put out the fire unless they do that. And it's also helpful if there are smoke alarms installed which are likely to alert the neighbour or the property owner that there is a fire, and they would be installed by the property owner or occupant, we would hope. It's also, if you're going to call OOO, you need to ensure that the telecoms are functioning, and that's going to then lead to the dispatcher sending a fire truck. So you need, one thing for that is that you need maintenance contractors keeping these things up to date. The truck needs to be ready to go, and so you rely on equipment suppliers to provide those trucks and other equipment, such providers of slippery poles, for example. For the truck to speed to the fire, the streets need to be accessible. The road authorities need to actually keep it in a state that's going to be accessible, and that's part of their remit. It's part of what they have to take account of. And to hose the fire with water, there needs to be a fire hydrant that's working, and the Water Corporation has a responsibility in all of that. So what we find, interestingly, is we unearth two types of contributors to the output of a fire brigade. Firstly, the internal contributors, the various kinds of staff that work inside the fire brigade, but also external or co-producers, external contributors or co-producers, the various parties we've identified in that diagram. So already it's clear that a fire brigade relies on contributions of time and effort by external actors. But wait, there's more. So far we've only been considering the purpose of a fire brigade framed in output terms. But when we go further and frame it in outcome terms, namely to minimise the damage to life, limb and property arising from fires, we find that co-production is an even bigger part of the picture. So here's the analysis that we got to it thus far. What you find is here that we've got the output shown as a contributor to the broader outcome of minimising the damage to fire and so on. But what's interesting is this broader outcome can be achieved in a variety of ways in addition to the output of the fire brigade. So firstly, it's more likely to happen if there is timely evacuation from the burning house. That's more likely to happen if the owner or occupant had a fire response plan already formulated. It's also going to help if the fire occurs but has less impact on the house, and that's going to happen if the house is built to resist fire, again a function of the owners and occupants. It's also going to minimise damage if the house is less likely to catch fire in the first place, and so if there are fire prevention measures in place. So what we find is that when we think in outcome terms, the work of the property owner or occupant, who by the way is the nearest thing the fire brigade has to a client, has to do some work to ensure that this purpose of the fire brigade is achieved. And what it means that thinking in terms of outcomes, and building standards would ensure that the property owner, or help ensure the property owner does the right thing in terms of the shape of the building. So what this tells us is that thinking in terms of outcomes expands the work done by potential contributors. Property owners, for example, the nearest thing to clients, do more than just call OOO and sit back and wait for the service to be delivered to them. they play an active part in reducing the damage that fires might inflict. An outcome